let's talk about some nonfiction. I've never been the biggest nonfiction reader, but last year I kind of set a goal for myself to read one nonfiction book a month, and somehow I completed that without even trying. I'm finding that nonfiction is great to go to when I just want to listen to an audiobook because it reminds me of listening to a podcast or watching a documentary, and those are things I already love. As I've mentioned many times, I took off about 6 months from this channel, and now I have a ton of books to recap for you. So in this video I'm going to review all of the nonfiction books I read in those 6 months. The first one is Smoke Gets in Your Eyes by Doughty. This is a book written by a mortician who kind of wants to explain the ins and outs of the death business, essentially. I'd heard a lot of good things about this book and how it changed and normalized death for them and changed their perception of it, which is why I ended up picking up this book. Unfortunately for me, I just didn't really get that. I found a lot of the chapters kind of rubbed me the wrong way. I talked about this in my most disappointing books of the year video. I know that Doughty has a big social media presence, and I've never followed her, so I don't know anything about her personally, but this book just really didn't do it for me. I enjoyed hearing about how the mortuary industry runs as a whole and how it's a business just like anything else. I thought that part was interesting, but the actual everyday ins and outs of Caitlin's life in regards to being a mortician didn't really interest me as much as I thought it would. And I can't necessarily pinpoint why, but I just didn't jive with her writing style that much. I gave this 2 stars. The next thing I listened to was The Psychopath Test by Ronson. I previously listened to a podcast by Ronson, which was something to do with August Ames, who is a porn star who committed suicide, and honestly that podcast rubbed me the wrong way, so I don't know why I picked up this book, but I did. I've heard a lot of great things once again about Ronson in general, and this is one of those books that the cover has always drew me in. Like, I used to see this cover all the time whenever I'd go to chapters, and it would always catch my eye because of the bright colors and the images on it, and so I decided to finally listen to it on audiobook, and it just didn't really do a whole lot for me, and I think it has to do with the way Ronson does what he does, because this was true of the podcast I listened to as well. He tends to kind of meet somebody who's involved with whatever topic he's talking about, and he'll kind of interview them and talk about them in this wry British way. It just doesn't really connect with me. He talked a little bit about psychopath behavior and how many people use it to their advantage to become leaders of their industry, but then how other people who maybe don't have the same advantages as those people end up going to prison. And I get it, but I just didn't feel like I was learning anything, or at least learning enough. It was just something I was listening to pass the time, and I wish that I just wish there was more evidence, more data, instead of like very personal anecdotes. Because while personal observations are nice, they don't really mean anything in the grand scheme of things. I think that they kind of have to go with some sort of research. And that's what was missing here. I gave this 2.5 out of 5 stars. The next book I listened to was an arc I got, and this is To Be Honest by Michael Leviton. This is a memoir about Michael Leviton and his somewhat weird upbringing. He was essentially taught to always be honest, no matter what. And while there are lots of people out there who believe that they're honest, him and his family take it to another level. He kind of talks about his family dynamics as well as how that affected him going forward in his life, how he had to learn and grow from that experience and realize that maybe being honest isn't always the best thing. And I hated this book at first, but near the end I actually came to appreciate it because you truly do feel like he's being honest. I think when you write a memoir, it is so easy. I think when someone's writing a memoir, it is so easy to kind of sand down their own edges because of course they're writing things from their perspective. And so it's easy for them to kind of convince you that they're right and that there's no other way to look at it except for their way. And no matter what, you end up empathizing with them, liking them, because they've taken away all their shitty parts, essentially. Whereas I feel like Michael Leviton did a great job of showing us everything. Like, I truly hated him for the first half of the book. I thought he was such a sanctimonious prick. But I think that just goes to show what a truthful writer he was being, because he truly did grow from his experience. By the end of the book, he realizes why all the things that he used to say and do were wrong. And he wrote them in anyways, because like, he had to show you that side of himself for you to truly grasp his life. I don't necessarily know if you're going to take anything profound away from this novel, but if you're a nosy person like me who just wants a fun read, this is a pretty good one. I especially liked the chapters on his relationships because, yeah, I can't imagine dating a guy like this, but they were interesting. And he's very raw and honest about his heartbreak. I gave this 3.5 out of 5 stars. The next thing is If You Tell by Gregg Olsen. This was very much a true crime novel about a family who underwent serious abuse. This probably had some of the worst abuse I think I've ever heard about. Obviously, abuse stories are always very dark and impactful, and this one was even more so. If you can't handle dark subject matter, do not even try to pick this one up, because it is truly quite bleak. The main abuser in this story is the mother of these 3 girls, and I think it's always good to kind of put a spotlight on female abusers, because I feel like we sometimes just skip over that and we don't talk about that enough. And so a lot of victims come forward talking about this and they're not believed because they don't believe a woman is capable of such cruelty. And this book really shows just what someone sadistic and sick and twisted can do to even their own children. It also shows not just the physical abuse, but the mental abuse as well. It shows how these children were turned against each other and used against each other. It also shows how people outside the family were tricked and abused as well. The story also ends in multiple murders, something to know before going in. And yeah, it was overall a really harrowing story, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. The next thing I read was White Fragility by Diangelo. This is a book about racism that tries to tackle the term of white fragility, of white people being too scared and too defensive to deal with their own internalized racism, because we all have it, because we've grown up in a racist system. We've grown up in a racist society. You know, and it kind of talks about how we all have blind spots, how we all need to be actively working to offset racism, or else we're not helping at all, and we need to be open to listening to other people's experiences. We need to be open to hearing that we are racist or that we've done something wrong, and that our own fragility and our own emotional interests can't get in the way of that. I think that this book did a really good job of kind of speaking some harsh truths that I think a lot of white people need to hear, and of course, because it comes from another white person, many people might be more open to hearing those truths, which is gross, but I think it's a good place to start, and hopefully for most people it will open their eyes and open their minds a little bit more to go forward and read some better text. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. The next thing I read was Disfigured by Amanda Leduc. This book is about fairy tales, the Disney version as well as just like the original text, and how they often paint disabled people in a gross, negative connotation sort of way. I do feel like I thought about some things in a way that I wouldn't have thought of them before. I've never been particularly interested in fairy tales in any way. I'm not like a Disney girl, so I guess I just haven't watched those movies enough to even really think about it this way. But I definitely thought that having it brought up makes you think about what children are ingesting on a daily basis. It also makes you think about how often disabled people are either outright ignored or painted in a bad light, painted as something that should be fixed, instead of just the way they are, living their lives. As someone who has like an invisible condition, I probably think about disabilities more than most, so this wasn't anything that was particularly new to me, but I still enjoyed learning more about it. And I did enjoy the personal aspect that Amanda Leduc brought to it. I found the book a little bit dry at times, like I was reading a research paper, but I think that for a lot of people, they will really enjoy this. It wasn't necessarily my thing, but I gave it 3.5 out of 4 stars. But I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars. And I definitely don't regret listening to it. The next thing I read was Educated by Tara Westover. This was a memoir about her experience being brought up in a survivalist, conspiracy theory sort of family. I saw this book everywhere, and I honestly had no intention of reading it, but like I said, I've been on a nonfiction kick, so I figured why not. I saw that the audiobook was available at my library, so I picked it up. Or did I get it on Audible? You know, I can't remember. I might have just had an extra Audible credit before I canceled Audible, and so maybe that's how I ended up with it. Doesn't matter. Anyways, I actually really enjoyed this. I think that Tara Westover does a really good job of writing just in general. Like, she made it so personable, even though, like, obviously this is nothing I've ever encountered or dealt with in my life. She just has such an honest and open way of writing. Obviously there was a lot about how her family wanted to live, like, kind of off the map and off the grid and all that, and that stuff would have been interesting enough on its own, but I also thought just the family dynamic aspects of this, the emotional abuse aspects of this were even more interesting, because it really shows how even if you're not being physically abused, which she was being physically abused by her brother, so there's that too, but even if you're not, even if it had just been the emotional abuse, it just showed how deep that stuff can go and how terrible that can be even without the physical aspect. The gaslighting in the family especially was just so constant and all-consuming that I can't imagine having to deal with that on a daily basis. I will say the one thing I did not enjoy about the book was there was one chapter where the N-word was used constantly, and I understand the point. It was to show, like, how ignorant her family was and how she had gone away and finally, like, seen more of the world, and she now understands the gravity of that word. But I didn't think it needed to be used, like, 15 times in, like, the span of a couple minutes, because it was just, I didn't need to hear it. Nobody needs to hear that word to understand the gravity behind it. Like, we get it. So that's something to know going in if you're going to listen to this, because it was really jarring. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. I am not an expert on memoirs, so I enjoyed this one, and if you're at all interested, I would recommend it. Next thing I listened to was Atomic Habits by James Clear. This is a self-help book that is basically just all about how you can tweak certain things in your life to make your goals easier. Listening to this, I realized pretty quickly that I don't like being told what to do or how to think. I've known this for a while about myself, but reading this just made it clear, because I was having such a hard time listening to this at first. Self-help books are so not my thing specifically for that reason, but I went into this because I heard that this one was a lot more actionable. Like, it would give you actionable steps to doing things. It wasn't just about changing your mindset, it was about, like, actually changing the things around you to make your life easier. I think, honestly, a lot of the stuff he says is kind of common sense. A lot of these things are things I've realized and utilized in my own life long before this book. You know, he talks about how if you put things out in the open, it reminds you to do certain things more without you having to even think about it. Like putting a bowl of fruit allows you to pick up fruit more often instead of having it hidden away in the crisper. That's something I feel like most people do already. Like, I always put my pills in certain areas because that's the only way I'm going to remember to take them. He also talks a lot about pairing things you want to do with something you need to do. If you want to watch YouTube videos but you need to exercise, maybe you can watch music, or maybe you can watch YouTube videos while you exercise, etc. So very common sense things, but I do think he breaks it down in a way that is manageable and easier to hear, I guess. There's one anecdote where he talks about the cycling team where they changed all these very tiny issues they were having while training, and if you change all those issues by 1%, it will make a huge outcome possible, and how that team was like one of the worst teams ever, and by changing all these small things, they ended up winning their next tournament or whatever. I know nothing about cycling, but I thought that anecdote was really interesting, and it was definitely like the part I remembered from this book. I think if you're a self-help person, definitely give it a try. If not, you can probably just like read a couple articles about this and understand it without having to listen to the whole audiobook. I give it 3 out of 5 stars. And the last nonfiction book I listened to, and by far my favorite, was In Order to Live by Yeonmi Park. This book, holy shit. This is a memoir about this woman's life in North Korea and her escape from North Korea. And it was, once again, very fucking bleak. So be prepared before you go into this, because it was really depressing. Like, it definitely got me down for a while, and that's definitely something you need to be prepared for. But it was so interesting, and I learned so much. Like, I did not know anything about North Korea, really. And I don't think I ever would have learned anything about it. Like, it's not the type of information I come upon in my daily life, but I'm so glad I listened to this. You find out so much about how that country is and how their daily life is there, and just, I never knew like how poor the country was. And I mean, it's just on a whole other level. She talks about how at one point they have to collect and sell their feces to the government so that they can use it as manure and stuff for their crops, and I was just like, holy shit, like that's... And there were just so many tidbits like that. She tells it in a very frank, unemotional way, and while in most memoirs that might bother me, in this memoir, I get it. I would imagine that she has to distance herself from how horrible circumstances were that she was living in. The bravery this woman has is just insane. So much of this stuff that happened to her when she was like 13, 14, and it's mind-blowing that she was able to get through these situations as well as escape on her own accord, essentially. It also talks a lot about the propaganda that they face on a daily basis, and just like how like brainwashed everyone is there, essentially for their own survival though. She also talks about what it was like to go to China and to go to South Korea after that, and how bad things were for them once they got to China as well, because if you're found out in China, they will send you back to North Korea and back to their government, and in which case they will be enslaved. And she talks a lot about wanting to change the way that China deals with defectors, because of that fact they end up in the human trafficking industry because they have nowhere else to go. It was just so sad, but by the end very inspiring, because this woman was just the biggest badass. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars, and I thoroughly recommend it. Those are all the nonfictions I've read lately. I hope you like this video, and I hope you'll come back again soon. Bye.